This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm speaking with my dear friend and colleague, Nick Mott, award-winning journalist, producer, and now host of the new podcast, The Wide Open.
So the question is, how many grizzlies can we tolerate? How many grizzlies should there be? And this is the question we have for not just grizzly bears, but for really any species that we're talking about. How can we live with these things that we partially killed off to make our lives easier?
Season 1 of The Wide Open is a deep exploration of the Endangered Species Act, and new episodes are dropping weekly right now. Nick, thanks for joining me.
It's good to be here, Justin.
Yeah, so for folks that don't remember, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
I grew up in Kansas City. I was born on the Missouri side, raised on the Kansas side. And my dad has always been sort of construction adjacent. He ran a lumber company when I was real little, and then he went to work for sort of a door company. So garage doors, entry doors, windows, that kind of stuff. And my mom, she's done a number of things, mostly in the communications world, I would say.
So we're here to talk about your latest project, The Wide Open. Before we get into it, let's talk about the Endangered Species Act. Give us a brief history. What is the act? How did it come to be?
Sure. So, we've had a long history of wildlife law in this country, going back to the Lacey Act in the early 1900s, which sort of banned the commercial trade in wildlife. But, as the 20th century marched on, it became really clear that we were messing up wildlife pretty bad. So there were a couple of precursors to the Endangered Species Act, things that basically created a list of species that needed our help. Didn't do a lot, though. And so in 1973, under Richard Nixon, actually, the Endangered Species Act passed. It was almost completely bipartisan. There were just a few detractors, I think maybe 12 detractors in the House, completely unanimously passed in the Senate. It really didn't get a lot of publicity at the time.
Yeah.
But it was a really big deal. This was an era where we passed all of our landmark environmental laws. So under Nixon, actually, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, all of these things that are still on the books today, that are in fact our most powerful environmental laws, were passed under a Republican administration, which is a lot different than how we think about politics today, potentially.
Yeah, so that is interesting when we look back, and certainly contrasting with our current politics, to think that these landmark pieces of legislation came to pass under the Nixon administration. Was there something unique going on during that time that you think created the conditions for this type of legislation to go through?
Absolutely. There were a number of things going on. So, 73, we're coming out of several things. So we're coming out of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. So we're coming out of this really groundswell of activism to get things done politically. And that's part of what leads to the act. But as well, there's this real conservation-minded sort of ethos, this aura in the atmosphere almost. The first Earth Day has happened. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published. We were realizing collectively that the havoc we're wreaking on the natural world. The other thing that's going on is the Vietnam War and Watergate. So Nixon's president, and he's like, well, this stuff doesn't look so good for me. And this is a very cynical way of looking at it, because he privately told colleagues they basically didn't care that much about the environment. But he wanted to win publicly. He wanted something that would be politically popular, and there was demand for this.
So tell us about the Endangered Species Act in particular, and why it is such a powerful piece of legislation.
Absolutely. So the first thing you may have heard and already know about the Endangered Species Act is that there is an endangered species list. So the so-called list is actually, there's two categories of animals, and it's not just animals, I should say, it's plants and insects too. But the two categories are endangered and threatened. Okay. Endangered means something is in danger of going extinct, and being threatened means something is basically in danger of becoming endangered. So one category less severe. Okay. And what the law actually does is really interesting. Because it says if an agency is going to do a project that could affect an endangered species, it has to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Effectively, it prohibits the government from doing things that could lead to extinction or even harm a listed species. Okay. This is, it sounds kind of ordinary. It sounds like kind of common sense, but this is one of our few environmental laws that are what lawyers would call substantive rather than procedural. The Endangered Species Act is a hard stop. It said, one of the framers of the act called it had teeth.
Yeah, right.
It says you cannot do things. And there are other provisions in the act that apply not just to the federal government, but to anybody. They prohibit the take of species, whether that's killing or even harming habitat, it's come to be described as. So many folks call the Endangered Species Act the most powerful environmental law in the world because of its teeth.
And at the time when it was passed, those teeth were perhaps not recognized to be as biting.
The bill really got very little scrutiny in Congress.
Right.
I've talked with politicians who were around at the time and politicians who were around shortly after. Our own Max Baucus, for example, I talked with. He said an act like the Endangered Species Act is kind of like pressing the morality button. It's like doing the right thing and not thinking a lot about it.
Sure, yeah.
So politicians passed it and they just didn't think much like, oh, we might not be able to drill. This could affect massive developments or highways or all of these sort of infrastructure things. And even the very first paragraph of the act is this really biting indictment of like the logic of capitalism, of saying we've prioritized our development at the expense of ecosystems and species, that like there's this real downside to the logic that has propelled our country forward since its establishment. And that just flew under the radar at the time.
Just talk for a moment. I know you've been interested in doing a deep exploration of the Endangered Species Act since before I knew you. Why is it so captivating to you?
I grew up in Kansas, like I told you earlier, and didn't think a lot about it. It's mostly private land out there. I was in the suburbs, But then when I was in college, I started doing some journalism things and learned about this potential conflict between a prairie chicken and wind energy. And I thought that was interesting. And later I went on to do conservation work for AmeriCorps. And, I'd be doing things like cutting trees down to restore habitat for sage grouse, which haven't been listed yet under the Endangered Species Act. But I was out in the desert where there were endangered species. And one of the prominent ones was a desert tortoise. So it looks like a tortoise. And, I'd been told kind of how to deal with it if I encounter one, which I did. If you see one on the road, you're supposed to pick them up very gingerly and gently and very slowly move them so they don't get hit by a car. They were on a lot of people's radar, including some of the sort of big environmental conflicts we've heard about in recent years, like the Bundys were very furious about desert tortoises. Anyway, I was at a diner and I was wearing this government shirt, and these ranchers were like, basically tried to quiz me to see if I was working on tortoises. And they were like,
oh, yeah.
They were like, you know what tortoises are good for? Turtle soup. And that was just really intriguing to me, sort of how this weird species that like nobody ever really sees could make people so upset and spur so much passion. My first stint doing journalism in Montana, I was on the grizzly bear beat. I was covering delisting cases, which means removing Endangered Species Act protections in the courtroom here in Missoula, and just seeing all the things that are going on the ground in terms of coexisting with grizzly bears, frustrations over government policy about grizzly bears, lawsuits, all this stuff that the Endangered Species Act spawned. And it just seems so curious to me that, a species that, whether it's a desert tortoise or a grizzly bear, that none of us really have any tangible interaction with, or the vast majority of us don't, we have these so deeply held opinions and passions about them.
So what is The Wide Open? How did it come to be?
The Wide Open is a podcast and public radio show. It airs on Montana Public Radio, and it's a collaboration with the Montana Media Lab as well.
Okay.
The idea is this show will be a way we can keep highlighting really amazing journalism out of this region and storytelling. So instead of having to sort of reinvent the wheel for every show we release, I've been involved in a lot of other shows we've done here, including Fireline with you, Justin, and Richest Hill and Threshold and others. What we can do is use this as a home for really compelling storytelling that's unique to our region.
Okay, so Threatened is season 1 of The Wide Open. Tell us about Threatened.
Threatened explores this weird state of the Endangered Species Act we're in today, where it's one of the most loved and hated laws on the books.
Yeah.
So, when I say that, I mean like people love it. People are like, yes, grizzlies need protection. Yes, wolves need protection. And that makes some intuitive sense. But at the same time, it stops people from doing things. And so politically, in certain communities, it is immensely hated. And there have been hundreds of bills to both strengthen and weaken the act. None of them have gone anywhere. Mm-hmm. And we're just kind of stuck in this weird place. And so it's a series that's about the Endangered Species Act. So in a sense, it's about these species, but really it's about us and this weird political time we're in and about our democracy and these weird battles we find ourselves in that have to do with whether it be a snail darter or a grizzly bear or a wolf.
Yeah, episode 1 starts sort of in your backyard with you on a drive southbound from Livingston to go talk to some people about grizzly bears. Why start there?
As we're driving on the road here in Montana, there's all kinds of weird billboards we probably see for all kinds of stuff. And, I live in Livingston, like you said, Justin, and, we've got our share of billboards there too. But I noticed this last summer that there were some new ones that just sprung up. The first one I noticed on one side of the road said, "Delist grizzly bears to support a conservation success story." And that alone wasn't all that weird. And it was sponsored by a bunch of hunting organizations. And so to dig into that, if we remove protections, there's likely to be a hunt for grizzly bears. So there's a lot we could say about that.
Sure.
As I was driving back the other side of the road, there were 4 other signs, all of which were opposing delisting. And this was a really interesting time because the government hadn't actually proposed doing anything. The government had tried to delist grizzly bears 2 times. They'd failed. And the states of Montana and Wyoming and Idaho had petitioned the federal government to get bears off the list, but they were just thinking about it at the time. And still, there'd been this weird billboard battle that was forming. And this is a road, I should say, that, hundreds of thousands of cars, often out-of-state cars, driving to Yellowstone National Park go through every year. So, people that are coming to Montana as a destination from New York or Chicago or wherever, this is the impression they get of the things we fight about.
Yeah, and all the issues wrapped up within them, and they're probably thinking why, what the heck is going on here? Yet there's this immense battle about this concept of delisting that you mentioned a moment ago. When I heard of the Endangered Species Act, I thought the point is to bring species back to a sustainable population, and there's probably a point at which a species should be on the list and off the list. Well, it turns out that point is a bit of a moving target.
When you hear species is up for delisting or has been proposed to delist, it can sound like a really negative thing, right? It can sound like we're removing protections for an animal. This animal can be killed easier now. So first off, it's sort of a gut reaction, especially for a charismatic thing like a grizzly bear or a wolf. It sounds bad. But second, the Endangered Species Act, a lot of people describe as an emergency room for wildlife.
Yeah.
So wildlife only goes there when it's in this desperate need. And when it's out of the ER, when it's no longer in need of this emergency care, it would theoretically go to the states.
That should be hailed as a victory, right? That a species has recovered enough to the point where we could consider removing the protections.
Right, and that gets back to that first sign I described, delist grizzly bears to support a conservation success story. But then the trickiness is what is recovery? What constitutes a recovered population? And there are very weedy criteria the government has to fill for that. But if we're just talking population numbers, those numbers are, it's not like we collectively agree, all right, the grizzly bear population around Yellowstone should be X number.
Yeah.
The government sets recovery goals in terms of numbers. And a lot of people just think those are too low. So we're way over those numbers in the Yellowstone area. Same goes in the glacier area. Those are the 2 distinct population segments, to use the jargon, the two populations of grizzly bears that have any numbers in the lower 48 states. But a lot of people say there are a lot of other threats facing those grizzly bears, including, lack of genetic connectivity. If there's not genetic exchange between populations, they get inbred and suffer population level health that way. There's facing a lot of threats in terms of getting killed for eating livestock, getting killed on highways. And people fear that because of this sort of antipathy that is perceived, at least, by a lot of folks in the state towards predators like grizzlies and wolves, that if management turns over to the states, then there will be a lot more dead bears, basically. Recovery, what constitutes a recovered population, isn't really a scientific answer. It's like a social answer.
We'll be back to my conversation with Nick Mott after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, Have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
Hello, this is Jeff Ament from Deaf Charlie, and you're listening to Justin Angle's A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with Nick Mott about his amazing new program, The Wide Open.
Grizzlies are in 1% to 2% of the historic range they were in, and we're talking about taking them off the list. And of course, we could never have a fully recovered to what they were historically population because we've manipulated the landscape so much. We've built our roads and our cities, and there are hundreds of millions of people living in these ecosystems that were once inhabited by these animals that are hard to live with. So the question is, like, how many grizzlies can we tolerate? How many grizzlies should there be? And this is the question we have for not just grizzly bears, but for really any species that we're talking about. Like, how can we live with these things that we partially killed off to make our lives easier?
One of your guests says, more is not always better. And that kind of gets at the heart of that difficulty in sort of deciding at a social level, like, what is the tolerable, not necessarily correct, but what is the tolerable number of grizzlies in a particular area? And that's a part of it too that we didn't mention, is like it varies from area to area. Certain areas are probably able to support a larger population, and others, maybe we don't want that many, and that gets tricky too because these bears tend to go wherever they want.
So these animals are going to go where they want to go, and that can make life harder for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So the person you described with that quote is Mark Rose, livestock manager at B-Bar Ranch, and they have so many grizzly bears there. It's wild, and they prioritize coexisting. They don't want all the bears gone, but it's a really fair question. Like, he asks, is more always better? And to him, it seems like no. He showed me this folder of kills of his livestock, not just from grizzly bears, but from mountain lions and wolves too. And the state does reimburse ranchers for livestock loss if you can prove it. The problem is you have to be able to prove it. So you have to know where that animal has been killed, and you have to locate it before it's gone. I don't think this made into the episode, but he told me about, he watched a carcass one time, and within a few hours, there were, I think, 15 grizzly bears, wolves, coyotes, an unbelievable number of animals predating, just eating the carcass. And by the next morning, there was nothing left, nothing you could possibly prove. And so a common story you'll hear is like a rancher saying, I was 14 calves short. I was 14 cows short. Don't know what happened to them.
Yeah.
Could have been grizzlies, could have been wolves, could have been natural deaths, could have been something else. Who knows? But that makes a meaningful difference in livelihood.
Absolutely. And all the downstream effects of that. We've talked a lot on this show about the difficulty in keeping working lands working. These operations, we think that they work on huge margins. They do not. They work on thin margins, and loss to predation is a big threat to the business.
If a ranch goes out of business, it could mean that a friendly landowner takes over, preserves the landscape. So there's a real threat to ecosystems if we lose that working land. And that creates this really complicated picture. We often think about public land's value for our wildlife, but private land has an immense value for our wildlife too.
Absolutely.
So we have to find some way of supporting wildlife on both.
And so let's, in our remaining time, I want to shift gears to another sort of genre of Endangered Species Act conflict, so to speak. And that, for lack of a better word, seems to be the weaponization of the act. At least my perception of it is that it's often used as a tool to stop things from happening that people don't like. And sometimes that obstruction to a development project or some sort of initiative has little to do with the species that is endangered and more to do with just an opposition to some policy or some project.
This began early on in the days of the Endangered Species Act with a little tiny fish in Tennessee called the snail darter.
Yes.
this little 3-inch fish stopped a more than $100 million dam on the Little Tennessee River called the Tellico Dam. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld that this fish, because of the Endangered Species Act, can stop a dam. But that sort of playbook that you can use the Endangered Species Act to sue and stop a project really has taken off. And it took off in a big way, especially starting in the early 90s with multiple different owls. You might have heard of the northern spotted owl in the Northwest and the sort of impact that had on the timber industry. But then there's a lesser known story that we tell in the show about the Mexican spotted owl. And there's entire organizations dedicated to using this law in this way to stop things. A lot of people complain that, the Endangered Species Act, along with other environmental laws, clogs up our court system, that we can't get anything done collectively because of all of these lawsuits. At the same time, these litigators will say, well, we've protected tens of millions of acres. We've gotten all of these species protected and all of these habitats protected because of these species. It really depends on where you fall on the spectrum, but it unquestionably is a deep headache for anybody involved in the world of government projects, of conservation, whether it comes to logging and fuels reduction, whether it comes to oil and gas drilling. And this comes back to this idea, too, that the Endangered Species Act is substantive. It's one of the only laws we can use that says, stop, you can't do this.
Yes.
And we're in this time politically, too, where I think that power is kind of appealing because we can't get anything done in Congress. And this is a way we can much more easily get our way. We're like, no, don't do that. Endangered Species Act says you can't. So it's really appealing if you don't want something to happen. But if you do, it's a real pain in the neck.
And I'm sure there's been all sorts of shenanigans around hey, let's go find an endangered species so we can say no to this project. And probably, maybe, I don't know if you wanted to tease any of the details, but have there been cases of species being smuggled from place to place to sort of drum up a case?
I can't say for sure yes or no on that, but what I will tell you is sort of the inverse of that, where on a lot of private land for years and years, there's been this saying, SSS, or shoot, shovel, and shut up.
So you find, get them out of there.
Yeah, you find a species that's endangered, whether it's a bird or a wolf or a grizzly, you kill it, you bury it, you don't tell anybody. One of the biggest demands from the private property side around the Endangered Species Act is both more flexibility for landowners, but especially more incentives. Instead of penalizing, if we think about our environmental laws as systems of carrots and sticks, you need the stick, you need the regulation for sure, but then you also need the carrot. You need to incentivize people to do things. And there are mechanisms in the Endangered Species Act to do that. They're harder to achieve, and it's also harder to fund. When we're talking about private lands conservation, getting people to actively take measures when margins are already really thin is tricky business, especially when we're dealing with a relatively static budget.
Are there examples of successful delisting? I suppose the bald eagle might be an example, right? Because there's not many people that want to hunt a bald eagle. Maybe there are, but it's not a very vocal lobby. Let's put it that way.
Right. The bald eagle was a relatively non-controversial delisting. But most delistings are pretty controversial. We've talked about grizzly bears. Like I said, the government tried to delist those twice. Wolves, same thing happened. They tried to be delisted a couple times. It got overturned in court. And I should say the reason that those were unsuccessful is groups sued. Then judges said, well, government, you didn't quite tick all the boxes the right way, that there are still threats to the population. So they're back on the list. And what ended up happening with wolves was it took a writer on a big budget bill in Congress, meaning this last second thing slotted on to say, get rid of these protections for wolves and you can't sue about it. That was actually put on to a big congressional writer in 2011 for wolves in the Northern Rockies by Tester. Mm-hmm. One of the chief complaints about the Endangered Species Act is how hard it is to get species off. So there are these two numbers that get thrown around about the act that I think are really interesting. One is that people say the Endangered Species Act is this massive success. It's prevented 99% of species that are listed from going extinct. So they're still here, 99% of species. Sounds good. The other stat from the other side says is fewer than 3% of listed species have ever been delisted, which means it's become, they claim it's become sort of the Hotel California where you can check in but you can never leave. So depending on who you ask, it's either 99% successful at stopping extinction or only 3% successful at recovering species enough to remove protections. And that puts it in this weird partisan place we're in.
So give us an overview of season 1 Threatened. I mean, we talked about a variety of the issues. You start with grizzly bears. What are we looking at?
We got 8 episodes. We start with grizzlies. I'm still writing the last episode, but I think we're going to come back to grizzlies. We'll find. I'm not going to give away how it ends because I don't exactly know yet. But I'll say we span from the early days of the act, from the 1970s and those early snail darter days even, and it spans the country. It's not just Montana stories. Mm-hmm. Although we do have Montana stories in there. We have grizzlies and wolves, of course. But then we have other stories. We have stories about dams in the Pacific Northwest. We have stories about the rise of these litigators in the desert Southwest. And we have stories about hunting and hunting's value in conservation, and how the sort of, if you describe it as a weaponization, how the sort of progression of saying stop to things you don't like has unfolded from, one species stopping one project to this sort of like massive economy level scale in these really surprising ways that you've likely not heard about.
As you mentioned, you're still writing the remainder of the episodes. We're catching you at a moment where you're deep in it. And I guess I've had the privilege to see you in it on a variety of stories, whether it's when we worked on Fireline together, your amazing reporting on the flooding of the Yellowstone River a couple of years back, and now this. Like, you have an energy about you when you're deep in the story, and you can see like not only a deep command of the topic, but also passion. What's the experience like right now for you?
Stressful and tiring. I'm surprised you say these things about me right now because I'm deep in the weeds, but it does feel good to emerge from the weeds to talk about it. So I'm mostly just like alone staring at a computer and writing things and stressing out about what I'm going to do next, and then getting edits and being like, later today I have an edit meeting about an episode and I'm stressed about what my editors are going to tell me,
Yet you are playing a more public role on this project than other projects you've worked on. You're in the host seat, and that's a new role for you.
Absolutely. I'm really, really excited about this project, and that's truly how I feel. But I've got to be clear, this is the home stretch and it's crunch time, so I'm also real stressed.
Well, the show is amazing. Nick was kind enough to give me a sneak peek. When this episode airs, will be, 2 or 3 episodes in to Threatened, season 1 of The Wide Open. Nick Mott, I think this is not only important work, but work that listeners will find entertaining, educating, and really help us sort of understand these thorny issues. And you do a great job of not only choosing topics, but helping us understand.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. That's so awesome to hear. And I'll also say, listeners, follow the show wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, whatever, and leave reviews and tell people about it. Do all those things too.
Yeah, will it just be a podcast, or will it broadcast in some way on the radio?
It'll broadcast on the radio too, so you can likely hear it on the airwaves.
All right, Nick Mott, thanks for coming and sharing some of your time during a really busy time for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Kelly Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.